The dropship shuddered as it cut through the upper atmosphere, metal ribs humming under the strain. Inside, rows of cadets sat strapped into their harnesses, skin tones ranging from translucent blue to obsidian chitin to pale human tan. Helmets clinked softly, claws tapped against armrests, bioluminescent patches flickered in nervous patterns. Somewhere near the middle, the only human in the class sat motionless, fingers laced together, eyes half closed as if she might be meditating or sleeping. Her name was Lena Carter, and this was not the first time someone had tried to scare her with bad air. Opposite her, a tall, mantis-like cadet named Crix clicked his mandibles anxiously. His species' compound eyes reflected the red interior lights, making him look even more jittery. "The briefing said acid particulates," he rasped, trying and failing to sound casual. "Unshielded exposure can strip organ lining in minutes. Why would the Academy risk this level of damage for a field exam?" His translator collar rendered the harsh syllables into smooth standard, but the tension was still obvious. "Because survival looks different when no one is coming to save you," Lena said quietly, opening her eyes. They were a plain, unremarkable hazel, but there was a steadiness there that unnerved some of the others. She glanced up at the display showing their descent vector, watching the swirling clouds of the test zone grow closer. The fog looked almost beautiful from orbit, a pale, opalescent band wrapped around the planet like a delicate ring. Up close, she knew it would smell like burning metal and wet batteries. A smaller cadet with glossy purple scales, Ree, hugged her knees to her chest. Her species normally lived in warm, humid jungles, and she had trained hard to adapt to the sterile conditions of the Academy. "The instructors normally issue specialized respirators for high-tox environments," Ree muttered. "This time we get nothing. No powered filters, no sealed suits, just standard uniforms and our ingenuity." She tried to make the last word sound like a joke. It did not work. Lena watched a bead of condensation slide down the inner wall of the ship and flicked her gaze to the emergency equipment lockers. Empty. They had been stripped clean before launch, just as the announcement had promised. No extra masks, no spare filters, no chemical neutralizers. The message had been blunt. No technology beyond your suit's internal recorder, no external assistance. Survive for 6 hours or fail the course. The overhead speakers crackled. "Cadet Group Delta," came the voice of Instructor Var, cool and clinical. "You are approaching Hazard Zone 12. Atmospheric composition. Supersaturated aerosol of hydrofluoric, sulfuric, and assorted volatile acids. Natural ventilation minimal. Microscopic particulates capable of bypassing most commercially available filters. Objective: establish a temporary camp and maintain vital signs within safe range for 6 hours. You may not exit the drop zone perimeter. You may not contact orbit. You may not use prefabricated technology. The zone has not been cleared of native flora and fauna." A pause. "Average historical survival time for unassisted test subjects: 1 hour, 9 minutes. One of the cadets swore softly in a language the translator declined to render. Another, the ship bucked as it hit the top of the fog layer. Outside the hull, pale tendrils of vapor curled and clawed at the metal, leaving faint iridescent streaks wherever they touched. The display flashed a hazard warning and then switched to a schematic of the landing area. Broken terrain, scattered rock outcrops, shallow depressions that might be shelter or traps. The fog pooled in some places, thinner in others, flowing like a liquid that had forgotten it was born of air. Lena remembered smog warnings from old Earth documentaries, the yellow-gray haze that had once hung over cities, turning lungs into slow-motion crime scenes. She remembered volcanic eruption footage, ash clouds swallowing whole towns, people tying wet cloths over their faces because there was nothing else. Her grandfather had told her stories about industrial accidents, about coolant leaks and chemical spills, about the way communities learned to recognize danger by smell and color long before sensors were installed. "We survived because we had to," he had said, voice gruff but oddly proud. We learned to improvise, or we died. Simple as that. The human unlatched her harness with a quiet click as the ship's descent thrusters fired for the final landing burn. Gravity shifted, pressing her into the seat and then easing as the landing struts found solid ground. The hull groaned under the environmental stress, but the integrity readings stayed green. For now. A thin mist was already seeping around the docking seals, reacting with microscopic imperfections in the ship's outer coating. Tiny sparkles of corrosion bloomed like flowers. "Remember your training," Instructor Var's voice said. Metal nearest the opening began to discolor in seconds, faint pitting appearing like a rash. Ree flinched back, scales along her forearms lifting involuntarily. The gelatinous cadet's containment shell flashed with alarm lights. "Out!" Crick snapped, mandibles clacking. "We must move! Find high ground, away from low-lying concentration pockets. Go!" He was trying to take charge, driven by sheer survival instinct, but his eyes flicked to Lena regardless, looking for confirmation. "In groups," Lena said, voice steady but urgent. "No one alone. Stay low for now, not high. The fog is dense, but if there is any breeze at all, it will shear layers. The worst will settle into dips, the rest will move. We need to see how it flows before we choose elevation." She tasted the air at the edge of the lock, just a hint on her tongue, enough to feel the metallic tang. It was wrong, but not instantly lethal with the ship's air still mixing in. Yet. The cadets stumbled out onto the rocky ground, boots crunching on a surface that looked like it had been half melted and then frozen mid-flow. The fog pressed close, a milky shroud that cut visibility down to a few meters. Shapes loomed and vanished. Jagged stones, twisted stumps of something that might once have been plants, streaks of strange, glossy material where the acidic mist had condensed and run. The world felt small, claustrophobic, as if they were trapped inside the lungs of some enormous beast. Lena felt the exposed skin of her face prickle. Her eyes watered, not from emotion, but from the invisible needles drifting on the air. She blinked rapidly, letting tears wash the irritants away, then wiped them on the sleeve of her uniform. The fabric was designed to resist most common hazards, but she knew it would not last long if fully saturated. The others coughed, or made noises that were their species' version of coughing, clutching at throats and chests. Already, someone's breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. 6 hours in this would not be survivable without intervention. A tall, antlered cadet named Joran lurched to a stop and stared around wildly. "We cannot stay here," he said, voice strained. "The air is poison, the ground is unstable, the visibility is non-existent. We must pick a direction and move before we completely lose orientation." "And pick wrong?" Lena asked, scanning the shifting patterns of fog. "No." He swung his head toward her, antlers cutting ghostly arcs through the mist. "You would stand still and suffocate?" "I would stand still and learn," Lena replied. She crouched and ran her fingers over the surface of a nearby rock, watching as tiny droplets of condensed fog hissed and sizzled against it. The stone looked resistant, some kind of silica-heavy formation. Nearby, a piece of exposed metal scrap, maybe from an old probe or a previous class's equipment, was already pitted and softening. She filed that detail away. Stone good, metal bad. The others shifted restlessly, fog swirling around their legs. Heart rates spiked on the internal suit monitors, little icons flickering in the corners of their vision. The instinct to flee was pressing on all of them, a primal urge to escape, to find shelter, to put distance between their bodies and the invisible teeth in the air. Lena felt it too, but she had learned long ago that running without understanding just meant dying somewhere else. She lifted her gaze and watched the fog itself. It did not move randomly. There were currents, subtle but real, swirling against the ground, rising in thin columns, thinning slightly along one side where, perhaps, the slightest hint of a breeze pushed through a narrow gap in the terrain. The depressions in the ground were thicker with it, pools of heavier, denser mist that clung to the low points like liquid. "There," Lena said quietly, pointing to a shallow dip partially shielded by a curved ridge of stone. Shelter line. If we block off a section there, we can force the fog to flow around it, not through it. Ree stared between Lena and the indicated spot. With what? She asked hoarsely. We have nothing. No tools, no filters, no... We have rocks, Lena said. We have soil. We have whatever those resin deposits are. She nodded toward the glossy streaks on the stones. First, we need our lungs to keep working long enough to build anything. That means we need to stop breathing this stuff as much as possible. Which means, she added, feeling the first clear thread of a plan tighten in her chest, we start with our faces. The exam had officially begun the moment the airlock opened. For most of the cadets, that meant surviving long enough to be rescued. For Lena, it meant something else. It meant measuring, testing, building, turning a death sentence into a problem to be solved. As the acid fog curled around her boots and tried to sting its way into her skin, she squared her shoulders and let the fear settle into a small, manageable weight in the back of her mind. 6 hours was a long time, long enough to fail spectacularly, or long enough to construct something no one at the academy had ever seen before. The moment Lena stepped away from the landing site, the fog shifted around her like a living thing. Wisps curled and recoiled, as if irritated by her presence. She ignored the burn around her eyes and the faint sting against her cheeks, focusing instead on the subtle movements of the vapor and the shapes of the terrain beneath it. If she wanted to keep the others from falling apart emotionally and physically, she needed information. Fast. Panic was already building behind her. She heard a rasped cough, a choked whine, claws scraping against half-melted stone, but she did not turn. She knew from experience that if she made herself look confident, the others would at least stay close. That was step one. A low ridge of stone curved ahead of her, smoother on one side as if centuries of wind had shaped it before the acidic mist claimed the land. She approached it carefully, bending close enough to smell the rock through the chemical tang. Silica-rich again, resistant to corrosion. The slick patches of hardened resin along the ridge were more interesting. Pale amber streaks clung to the surface in uneven swaths, some fresh and tacky, some hardened into glass-like plates. A local plant, maybe, something that secreted resin when stressed. She pressed a fingertip lightly against one of the hardened plates. It held firm. The softer streak, however, clung to her fingertip and began to bubble at the edges as the acidic air interacted with it. Good. That meant a chemical reaction was happening on the resin surface before the acid reached the stone beneath. A neutralizing layer, or at least a barrier that slowed corrosion. Exactly the kind of material she needed. Behind the ridge, a cluster of broad-leafed plants huddled against the stone. Their leaves were tough, thick like animal hide, coated in a dusty film that seemed to resist the fog. She reached out and touched the edge of one leaf, feeling the strange texture. Not smooth, not sticky, more like powder layered over wax. The plant had adapted to survive here. It trapped the acidic particulates on the outer coating and prevented them from eating into the softer tissue below. She snapped off a small fragment, holding it close to her face. The scent was strong and earthy, almost sweet beneath the harsh chemical bite of the fog. Her mind sorted through memories, earth plants with similar defenses, wax-coated leaves that shed water or resisted pests. Survival, universal across worlds. Crix approached her cautiously, his tall frame weaving through the fog with jerky steps. He clutched his breathing membranes with both claws, struggling to keep the mist from reaching the delicate tissues beneath the thin covering of his uniform hood. His mandibles clicked in agitation. "We are losing time," he said, the translator stiffening the words. "Some cadets already have respiratory distress. Joran collapsed once. His antler membranes are too exposed. What are you doing over here alone?" "Looking for tools," Lena said, crouching down to inspect the soil near the plant cluster. The ground was damp and dark, richer than she expected in such a hostile zone. When she dug her fingers into it, The texture was thick and clay-like. She squeezed, feeling its weight and cohesion. Perfect. This is clay. Good clay, actually. It seals well, holds shape, resists airflow. We can use it. Crix's antennae twitched in disbelief. Clay. Leaves. These are not tools. We need real filtration, not primitive. Primitive works, Lena said sharply. She did not raise her voice, but the force behind her tone made him fall silent. Your lungs are already irritated. Ree is worse. If she keeps breathing this stuff in, she will lose consciousness within the hour. Unless you know how to conjure a respirator out of nothing, we use what's here. Earth didn't survive millions of years because it grew technology on trees. It survived because we improvised. Crix stared at her as if he wanted to argue, but another harsh cough racked his body. He bowed his head slightly and stepped back. The sound of his chitin scraping against stone was subdued, defeated. Lena examined the clay again, testing how it reacted to the fog. Tiny droplets landed on the surface and fizzled, but the reaction was slow. The outermost layer degraded, but the core stayed intact. If she shaped it into a mask, lined it with leaves for structure, and filled gaps with plant fiber, it could work. Not perfectly, but long enough to give everyone a fighting chance. She scraped a handful of clay into a makeshift bundle of cloth, torn from the inner layer of her uniform's sleeve. It wasn't ideal, but it would hold the material until she shaped it. Her eyes drifted to the resin streaks again. Fresh resin reacted visibly to the fog. Hardened resin did not. That meant she could coat surfaces with fresh resin and let the fog harden it into a protective shell. The idea crystallized in her mind. Clay for the base, leaves for the outer layer, fibers for straps, resin for sealing. It would work. Ree stumbled toward her next, scales dulled and throat lights barely glowing. She clung to her chest, breathing in shallow sips. Lena, I cannot. My lungs burn. Her voice was thin, trembling. Lena caught her by the shoulders before she fell. The small-scaled cadet was shaking violently, her normally vibrant body heat now faint through the uniform. Lena guided her to the side of the ridge where the fog thinned slightly. Sit. Don't talk. Close your mouth and breathe slowly through your nose, even if it hurts. She knelt in front of Ree and brushed away a smear of corrosive mist collecting on the girl's sleeve. I'm making something to help you breathe. Just stay with me. Ree nodded weakly, squeezing her eyes shut. Her breath came in slow, agonized pulls, each one wheezing through her narrow lungs. Lena worked faster. She gathered larger leaves, snapping them off at the stems, then layered them until she had a thick stack. The fog reacted to the leaves' coating but did not penetrate quickly. She tore fibers from a plant root, braiding them into crude ties. With her knife, a simple regulation training blade, she carved out a shallow mold in the clay-packed ground, shaping it into a curved basin roughly the size of a face. She pressed clay into it, smoothing it with practiced motions. The clay stuck to her fingers and smeared under her nails, but she kept going, sculpting a mask shape by instinct. Crix returned, dragging Joran with him. The antlered cadet leaned heavily against him, his breath ragged, his eyes unfocused. A faint greenish tint discolored the tips of his antlers, signs of chemical burn spreading through his sensory membranes. Help her, Crix rasped. Please. Lena nodded once. Lower him next to Ree. Keep him still. She worked the clay mask into shape, adjusting the nose ridge and smoothing the inner surface until it would fit snugly. When it was ready, she pressed the broad leaves across the exterior, letting the natural wax form a first layer of protection. Next came the resin. She approached a fresh streak on the stone ridge and scraped a glob of the tacky substance onto a flat piece of bark. The fog immediately began to react with the resin, making it bubble and solidify. She hurried back and spread the resin along the seams of the clay mask before it hardened completely. Each stroke formed a tightening seal. When she finished, the mask looked crude, uneven, almost primitive, but functional. She lifted it and held it to Rhee's face. "Hold still," she said gently. Rhee obeyed, her small hands trembling as Lena tied the fiber straps around her head. The mask covered her nose and mouth completely, fitting snugly against her scaled skin. Lena watched the first few breaths carefully. The wax-coated leaves and burn-resistant clay filtered the fog. The resin seams protected the gaps. Rhee's breaths stabilized, still painful, still shallow, but no longer panicked. Rhee opened her eyes and blinked up at her. "It works," she whispered, astonished. Lena allowed herself a small smile. "Of course it works." She stood and turned to Crix and Joran. "I'll make more. Gather clay, leaves, roots for fiber, and fresh resin. Bring anyone who's struggling. We're not dying in this place." For the first time since they landed, Crix stared at her with something like real respect and a flicker of hope. Fog swirled around her ankles, hungry and persistent, but Lena no longer cared. She had work to do. The others were suffering, and if she didn't move fast, several would not last another hour. But the materials were here. The method was proven, and she had built the first mask in minutes, not hours. She grabbed more clay, more leaves, more resin. She would build another mask, and another, and another. Because once she started solving a problem, she did not stop. Not until everyone around her had a fighting chance to breathe. Lena worked with a speed and precision that would have shocked any instructor watching from orbit. Her fingers moved through the fog as if she were sculpting in clean air, not in a poisonous haze that stung her skin and made her eyes water. The first mask had stabilized Rhee, and that single success sharpened her focus into something fierce, almost surgical. She no longer hesitated. Every movement had purpose, every breath carried determination. Crix hurried back with more clay clutched in both claws, chunks of dense earth packed against his chest. His chitin had started to dull from exposure, but his breathing had steadied since he had kept a strip of thick leaf pressed over his mouth. He dropped the clay at Lena's feet and stepped back, coughing behind the makeshift leaf filter. "More resin is coming," he rasped. "Joran cannot collect anything, but he can help carry." Lena nodded without looking up. She was already shaping another mask, pressing the wet clay into a curve that would fit Crix's elongated face. She murmured half-formed calculations under her breath, adjusting widths and angles based on what she remembered from medical diagrams of his species. His breathing membranes were vulnerable, but his jaw structure could support a tighter fit. She reinforced the lower section with an extra leaf layer before sealing the outer edges. By the time she finished Crix's mask, Joran arrived carrying a slab of hardened resin in his trembling hands. His antlers drooped, the tips still tinged with greenish burn marks. His breath rattled, but the shallow shelter behind the ridge had slowed the worst of the fog's effect on him. He lowered the resin piece and struggled to straighten. "Instructor Var warned us this test was designed to eliminate those who panic," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I assumed she was exaggerating." "She wasn't," Lena said. She scraped the resin with her knife, gathering a thin line of semi-soft material that had not yet fully hardened. "Hold still. Once this hardens, it will keep the clay from cracking." Joran extended a shaking hand and steadied the mask as Lena worked. His fingers brushed her wrist, and he startled at how warm her skin was compared to the cold stone beneath him. "You work as if you have done this before," he murmured. "Not this exactly," Lena replied, pressing the resin along the mask edges. "But close enough." She did not elaborate. She did not want to explain the wildfire smoke that once blanketed her city when she was a child, the industrial accident her mother had been caught in when the factory's filters failed, or the way she had watched her neighborhood hand-stitch cloth masks with charcoal and wax layers because the government provided nothing. Those memories rose without invitation, but they gave her hands confidence rather than fear. Crix leaned closer. "Is it ready?" "Yes," Lena said. She lifted the completed mask. "Put it on. Breathe shallowly for the first few minutes. The clay will adjust as it dries. Crix slid the mask onto his face. The shape fit surprisingly well, molding to his elongated features. He inhaled cautiously. His mandibles clicked once, then relaxed. His shoulders untensed as his breathing eased. "It works," he whispered, awe softening his rasping tone. "I can breathe." "Good," Lena said. "Now help me with the next one." Crix straightened and nodded with silent determination. He turned and sprinted into the fog to gather more leaves. His footsteps echoed faintly before vanishing into the muffled haze. Lena turned her attention to Joran. The antlered cadet was watching her with a mixture of fear and hope, his pupils dilated from stress. She reached for more clay. "Your turn." He tried to smile, but it came out twisted with exhaustion. Still, he lowered himself onto one knee and held still while she shaped the mask. His facial structure was wide, the cheekbones high, the nose ridges shallow. She adjusted the design accordingly, pressing leaves into place and smoothing clay over them. Her fingers shook only once when a drop of acid fog burned her knuckle. She hissed in pain but kept working, using a strip of cloth to wipe away the stinging residue. "Your skin," Joran murmured. "It is not built for this. You will injure yourself." "I'll heal," Lena said. "Put the mask on." He obeyed. His breathing stabilized almost instantly. Relief washed over his features like a tide. He closed his eyes and just breathed for several seconds before whispering, "Thank you." Lena stood and wiped her hands on her uniform. The clay left streaks along the fabric, but the marks didn't matter. Her eyes scanned the fog, counting silhouettes. Two more cadets approached, one stumbling, one dragging another by the arm. Both were maskless and wheezing. Lena sprinted toward them before they collapsed completely. The first was a thin, reed-like woman whose slender frame shook with each breath. Her lungs could not handle the particulate density. The second cadet was muscular and broad, but his breathing was shallow, fast, desperate. He clutched his throat as if he could squeeze the acid out of his lungs. Lena grabbed the reed-like woman by the shoulder and pressed a thick leaf to her mouth. "Breathe through this," she ordered. "Slow and steady." The woman obeyed, her hands trembling as she held the leaf in place. To the muscular cadet, she pressed a chunk of clay directly under his nose. "Inhale through the clay. The moisture inside it will slow the particulates. Do not talk." He nodded weakly, relief flickering through his eyes. "Sit behind the ridge," Lena said. "The fog thins there. I will make masks for both of you as soon as I gather more resin." She turned to run back for supplies, but her foot slipped on a patch of slick stone. Her knee struck the ground, sending a sharp jolt up her leg. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself up. There was no time to rest, no time to feel anything. Joran limped forward and caught her elbow. "You are hurting." "I'm fine," Lena said. She pulled away gently. "We have more cadets incoming." She returned to her worksite and grabbed a handful of clay. The others hovered nearby, ready to obey her next instruction. She shaped another mask quickly, her fingers moving automatically. Each step was smoother, faster, more confident. She coated the mask with hardened resin flakes and pressed fresh resin along the seams before the fog froze it into place. More cadets emerged from the mist, some staggering, some coughing violently. Lena didn't pause. She built mask after mask. She reshaped one for a cadet with an elongated snout. She constructed another with extra sealing along the sides for someone with delicate ear membranes. Each species required adjustments, and she made them on the fly, her mind calculating biological differences even as she worked. Her hands were raw, her nails were caked in clay, her knuckles were red from acid burns, but she kept building. At one point, Crix returned with a huge slab of resin nearly as wide as his torso. He dropped it beside her and spoke through his mask. "The plants grow in clusters on the far side of the ridge. There are enough leaves for everyone." "Good," Lena said. "Help Ree braid more straps." Ree nodded weakly but obeyed. Her small fingers moved through the fibers, weaving them faster and faster as her breathing strengthened with each minute she wore the mask. By the time Lena finished the 8th mask, the fog around her had thinned slightly from the cadet's movement stirring it. The air was still deadly, but she could see more clearly now. Shapes emerged, frightened faces, trembling bodies, hopeful eyes watching her as if she had become their anchor in the storm. She wiped sweat from her brow and reached for Clay again. "You need to rest," Joran said gently. "I will rest when everyone can breathe," Lena replied. Her voice was calm, firm, almost quiet. But everyone heard it. More clay, more leaves, more resin, more masks. Her hands moved faster, her mind sharpened further. Survival was no longer a distant objective. It was something she was constructing with her own fingers, one mask at a time. And as each cadet put on a mask and took a full, clean breath for the first time since landing, Lena felt something ignite inside her, a fierce resolve that burned hotter than the acid stinging her skin. She was not just helping them breathe, she was preparing them for what came next, and the fog had no idea what was about to hit it. Lena stepped back from the group of cadets long enough to finally survey the terrain with clearer vision. The masks had stabilized almost everyone, and for the first time since landing, the cadets were breathing steadily rather than gasping in panic. But the fog was thickening again, swirling in denser coils that crept across the ground like a hunting animal seeking warm lungs. The temporary relief she had given them would not last unless she turned the patch of safer ground behind the ridge into a genuine refuge. She wiped a streak of hardened clay from her cheek and studied how the fog moved, watching its currents with the same intensity she once used to analyze storm patterns on Earth. The ridge created a partial barrier, but the fog still spilled over it in slow, poisonous waves. She crouched and traced the lines of airflow with her hand, feeling the faint temperature differences along the rock. There were dips, shallow channels carved by wind or erosion that funneled the fog in specific directions. If she could redirect those channels, she could force the fog to flow around the ridge instead of into the sheltered space behind it. Joran approached her slowly, his newly masked face steady now that the clay had dried enough to hold its shape. His steps were careful, mindful of the slick ground. "Is the fog worsening?" he asked, his voice still hoarse but no longer panicked. "It's settling lower," Lena said. "The temperature is dropping. That means heavier particulates will pool faster. We need a sealed area before the ground-level concentration gets too high." He glanced toward the cluster of cadets huddled behind the ridge, each wearing the handmade masks she had crafted. "What do you need?" "Stone," Lena answered. "Large pieces, and more resin. Fresh resin, not hardened. We'll use the fog to solidify it once we build the structure." Joran straightened his posture, a spark of determination sharpening his expression. "I will gather stone." Lena gave him a short nod and turned her attention to the soil. She scooped up a handful and squeezed it into a tight ball. It held its shape well even in the corrosive air, but she noticed the top layer dissolving slightly where the acid contacted it. That meant the clay alone would not hold long-term as a barrier, but layered with resin and rock, it could become the foundation of something far stronger. Crix arrived next, carrying an armful of long, reed-like plants with fibrous roots trailing behind him. "I found these near a melted drainage channel," he said through his mask. "The fibers are strong. Ree believes they can be woven." Lena examined the plants. The roots were thin but tough, perfect for cordage. She nodded and gestured toward a relatively flat patch of ground. "Good. Have Ree weave them into long lengths. We'll need them to bind the stone and clay." Crix didn't question her. He turned immediately and jogged away to deliver the plants. Lena returned to examining the ridge. The stone had survived acid exposure far better than the ground around it, which meant it had a high mineral resilience. She placed her palm against the surface and felt the texture, smooth in some places, jagged in others, but consistent enough to form the spine of a shelter. If she built walls branching outward from the ridge's natural curve, she could create a semicircle where the fog would be forced to split and move around instead of straight through. She marked the ground with her knife to outline the structure's base. Joran returned, dragging 2 massive stones, each nearly half his height. His muscles strained with effort, and his antlers shook from exertion, but he continued without complaint. He dropped the stones beside Lena and leaned heavily on one knee, catching his breath. "These should do," he said between gasps. "They will," Lena assured him. She ran her hands along the stone surfaces, checking for weakness. The edges were sharp, freshly split from larger formations. Perfect building material. One by one, she placed the stones into the marked positions. With each placement, she pressed clay into the gaps between them, using her full weight to pack it tight. Her palms stung from earlier burns, but she kept going, pushing the clay until it sealed the stones together. The dampness from the soil allowed the clay to remain pliable, yet firm enough to hold its shape. Ree approached with an armful of braided fiber cords. Her eyes were bright through her mask, more confident now that she could breathe without agony. "Is this enough?" she asked timidly. "For now," Lena said. "Tie the stone bases to each other, tight. Use every strand you have." Ree's hands moved quickly, her small fingers weaving cords through the natural grooves of the stones. Even through the protective mask, Lena could see how focused she had become. Panic had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. Crix returned again, dragging a sack-like bundle made from large leaves held together by fiber strands. "Fresh resin," he announced, "but it's unstable. It reacts faster now." "That's good," Lena said. She dipped a hand into the sticky resin, ignoring the immediate tingling sensation as the fog began interacting with it. She smeared it along the outer surface of the stones, sealing the clay and cords beneath it. The fog touched the resin and hardened it instantly, forming a smooth, glossy armor over the wall. Lena exhaled in satisfaction. If she coated the entire structure this way, the acid fog would have a much harder time penetrating. She repeated the process again and again, forming a semicircular wall. Joran and the others brought more stones, more clay, more leaves. Ree tied and reinforced the seams. Crix gathered resin and coated the surfaces. Together, the cadets worked with a rhythm that felt almost natural, like a survival instinct awakened by necessity. But it was Lena's eyes that guided the construction. She monitored every step, adjusting angles, reinforcing weak points, shifting stones to redirect airflow. The wall grew taller, curving inward as it rose, until it reached her shoulder height. She stepped back to inspect it. The fog hit the structure like a wave, splitting on impact. A visible pocket of cleaner air formed in the sheltered space behind it, swirling gently before settling into a thin, breathable layer. A collective breath of relief rippled through the cadets. "Good," Lena said. "Now we build the roof." She scaled the ridge, boots scraping against the stone. From above, she saw more resin pockets embedded in cracks. She reached for them, scraping fresh globs into a leaf bundle. When she descended again, she handed the resin to Crix. He peered at the half-built shelter. "How will we make a roof that doesn't collapse?" "By layering," Lena answered. "Clay first, then leaves, then resin, and we let the fog harden it." She climbed onto the lower stones and began spreading a thick layer of clay across the top edges. Her movements were precise, smoothing the surface until it formed a unified curve. Ree passed her broad leaves, which Lena pressed into the clay, creating an overlapping pattern like shingles. Then came the resin, smeared thickly over the leaves. The fog reacted immediately, sealing everything in a glossy shell. As she worked, a faint vibration trembled beneath her feet. Not from the structure, something else. A deep rumble carried through the stone. Joran stiffened. "Is that seismic activity?" "No," Lena said, listening carefully. "That's movement. Something heavy is shifting nearby." Crix tensed. "A creature?" Probably, Lena said. She did not look away from the roof. But it won't matter if we finish this before it comes close. She continued smoothing the resin, her focus unshaken. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances, but none stopped. The wall provided safety. The roof would provide more. Minutes stretched. The rumbling faded. Finally, with the last layer of resin hardening into a seamless shell, Lena dropped down from the wall and stepped into the sheltered space beneath the new structure. The air inside was different, less acidic, easier to breathe even without a mask. Joran stepped in and removed his mask cautiously, inhaling a slow, deep breath. His eyes widened. "The air is almost clean," he said in amazement. "It will stay that way," Lena said, "as long as the structure holds." Crix entered next, awe radiating from his posture. "You built this in less than an hour." "We built it," Lena corrected, "and now we reinforce it." She walked to the center of the clean air zone and pressed her hand against the ground. The soil here was damp and thick. If she dug a trench leading outward and directed fog into it, the weight of the clay and stone above would channel the toxic air away. Ventilation, crude but effective. She began marking the trench lines when Ree stepped beside her. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Lena met her eyes. "Now," she said, "we turn this shelter into a stronghold." And with that, the cadets, no longer frightened, no longer helpless, gathered around her, ready to build something even stronger than the fog that sought to destroy them. The word stronghold settled over the group like an invisible banner. The cadets straightened, chests lifting, shoulders squaring. The air inside the shelter was not perfect, but it was breathable enough that every inhale felt like a small victory. Outside, the fog pressed against the resin-coated walls in slow, roiling waves, frustrated and relentless. Inside, for the first time since landing, the rhythm of breathing was no longer a desperate, ragged chorus. Lena knelt in the center of the cleared floor and dragged the tip of her knife across the damp ground, sketching lines for drainage and airflow. "We do not just hide," she said, her voice steady. "We control the environment as much as we can. The fog is heavier than the air in here. If we give it somewhere to go, the clean air will stay higher." Crix watched the lines appear with a thoughtful tilt of his head. "You want to build channels under the shelter." "Exactly," Lena replied. "Shallow trenches leading out and down. The fog will sink into them and escape beneath the wall. The air above will be less dense, easier on our lungs." She looked up at him. "You have the strength. Can you carve those trenches from inside to the outer edge?" He glanced at his claws and nodded. "Yes, the soil is soft enough. I can do it." "Good," she said. "Ree, help him measure depth. No more than to your ankle height. Joran, organize the others into shifts. Some dig outside to expand the perimeter. Some gather more resin. Some watch for creatures. We do not know what else lives in this fog." Joran accepted the assignment with a solemn nod and turned to the cluster of cadets. He spoke with a confidence that had not been present before, directing individuals by name, assigning tasks based on limb strength, stamina, and species-specific resistance. If any instructor had doubted his leadership potential before this exam, no one watching now would. Lena moved to the shelter's entrance and leaned out, squinting into the milky haze. The world beyond the barrier seemed unreal, a drifting curtain of white that hid jagged stone and twisted plant life. The faint rumble she had heard earlier did not return, but the fog had a presence, as if something massive was breathing just outside her field of view. She watched the way it curled and flowed against the hard shell of the shelter, looking for weaknesses. None showed yet. The resin held. She did a quick circuit of the outer wall, checking seams and joints. Her fingers traced every line of hardened resin, every clay-filled gap between stones. Here and there, she added a smear of fresh resin for reinforcement, watching it bubble and then freeze into a smooth, glassy coating. Each improvement made her relax just a fraction more. Inside, Crix carved trenches with fierce concentration. His claws cut clean lines through the damp earth, forming a starburst pattern from the center of the shelter outward. Ree followed, measuring depth and smoothing edges so the fog would flow evenly. When the first trench connected with a small gap under the wall, a faint tendril of fog slipped inside, sank, and then slid out through the exit, pulled downward by its own density. The air above did feel lighter afterwards, as if the shelter had exhaled. "That is working," Ree said softly, amazement in her eyes. "The haze near the floor is thinner." "Good," Lena said. "We will still wear masks in here to be safe, but this will slow the damage." Time in the fog zone became a rhythm of effort and brief rests. The cadets dug in shifts, traded duties, and rotated watch at the shelter entrance. Whenever muscles trembled too much, Lena ordered the exhausted cadet to sit and drink from recondensed moisture collected on cooled stone. No one argued. She had proven that every instruction meant survival, not arbitrary control. At one point, a low scraping sound echoed through the haze. A few cadets froze, eyes wide, hands drifting toward improvised tools and exposed rocks. The sound grew louder, closer, like something heavy dragging itself over stone. A shadow moved in the opaque curtain of fog, massive and slow. A bulbous shape loomed, then slid past, the outline just clear enough to suggest a hulking body layered in protective plates. Acid dripped from its flanks and hissed where it fell. An enormous native creature, adapted to the poisonous air, passed within a few meters of the shelter and did not so much as pause. The structure's scent and texture blended with the ridge well enough that the animal ignored it, lumbering on toward some unseen destination. Several cadets released the breaths they had been holding. "If we had not built this, that thing might have stumbled right over us," Crix murmured. "Or stopped to see if we were soft," Lena replied dryly. "We are not interesting to it now. Good. Let us keep it that way." She checked the sky, what little she could see of it. The acid clouds above made the light diffuse and colorless, but the internal chronometers in each cadet's suit tracked time. They were approaching the 4th hour. Inside the observation room in orbit, Instructor Var watched the biometric data scroll past her display. Heart rates had stabilized. Oxygen levels, though lower than optimum, remained within survivable range. Core temperatures were holding steady. The alert markers that usually signaled panic and failing systems in this exercise had faded to near zero. She frowned. Beside her, an older instructor with deep blue skin and a jagged scar above one eye folded his arms. "You look disappointed," he said. "You expected another collapse?" "I expected struggle," Var replied, eyes still on the screen. "I designed this scenario to push cadets beyond rote learning. Every group before this one fractured. Some survived by luck, some by sacrifice. This group—" She zoomed in on a live visual feed from a drone hovering at the edge of the fog zone. The structure nestled against the ridge came into view, resin-coated and gleaming like a man-made shell. Tiny figures moved in and out, dug trenches, reinforced seams. "This group is turning my hazard zone into a field workshop." The older instructor let out a low, impressed whistle. "Is that a constructed shelter?" "It is," Var said. "No prefabricated equipment, no approved tech. All local materials." "Who is leading them?" he asked. Var tapped a control. The view zoomed in on Lena standing at the shelter entrance, speaking with Crix and Joran, gesturing toward the trenches and the ridgeline. Her face was streaked with grime and speckled with faint chemical burns, but her eyes were clear, focused, unafraid. "Cadet Lena Carter," Var said. "Human." "Of course," the older instructor muttered under his breath. "Humans." Var did not smile, but something in her gaze softened. "Extend the test to the full 6 hours," she ordered the system. "I want to see how far she pushes this." On the ground, Lena felt the passage of time through muscle fatigue and the gradual numbness in her burned fingers, rather than through any external change. The fog never cleared, never thinned beyond the pocket she had carved. It pressed onward, patient and corrosive. But inside the stronghold, the cadets ate small ration packs, stretched their limbs, and even exchanged a few quiet jokes through muffled masks. At the 5-hour mark, Joran approached Lena with a data slate from his suit's internal recorder. "We should log this," he said. "The methods you used, the materials we identified. Future classes could benefit." Lena wiped resin dust from her palms and accepted the slate. "Write everything you remember," she said. "Every mistake, every correction. I will add my notes." It felt like a statement carved into hostile ground. "We are not prey." When the extraction signal finally pulsed through their suit comms, a triple-beat tone followed by a flashing icon, several cadets flinched in surprise. For a moment, no one moved. The shelter hummed quietly around them, trenches faintly exhaling fog through hidden exits. "That is it," Joran whispered. "We passed the time requirement." Lena rose slowly, muscles protesting. She walked to the entrance and peered out. Through the endless white, a faint glow approached, growing brighter second by second. The dropship's landing lights cut weak channels through the fog, illuminating the smashed stones and scorched plant life. The vessel settled onto the ground with a hiss, engines humming at a low, steady pitch. The hatch opened. Clean, filtered air spilled out, colliding with the fog in a swirling clash. A ramp extended. Instructor Var stood at the top, silhouette sharp against the interior lights, her posture perfectly straight. "Cadet Group Delta," her amplified voice called. "Report." Lena glanced back at the others. Some looked exhausted, some proud, some dazed. All were alive. She stepped forward first, walking out of the shelter and into the semi-cleared area between the stronghold and the ship. The fog curled at her ankles, reluctant to release her. "We are here," Lena answered. "All accounted for." One by one, the cadets emerged behind her, masks in place, movements deliberate. Var's gaze flicked over each face, cataloging burns, postures, and subtle signs of strain. Her eyes lingered on the shelter, the resin-coated walls, the carefully dug trenches that channeled fog away. "Explain," she said finally, looking at Lena. Lena stood with her shoulders squared, as if the fog had never weighed on her lungs. "We identified resilient materials," she said. "Clay with decent cohesion, wax-coated leaves, natural resin that reacts with acid. We built respirators and a barrier, then used airflow and density differences to create a cleaner internal zone. The trenches vented heavier fog beneath the structure. Once the masks stabilized oxygen intake, we focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term hiding." Several instructors standing behind Var exchanged looks. One whispered something under his breath. Another checked a datapad, astonished by the biometrics. "And why?" Var asked. "Did you choose to coordinate the entire group rather than secure a smaller section for yourself and a few others? You could have increased your personal survival odds." Lena did not hesitate. "Because you have exceeded the parameters of this exam," Var said at last. "The purpose was to measure resilience under unassisted exposure and to observe decision-making under stress. In previous runs, cadets fractured, hoarded resources, or froze. You constructed a defensible position, improvised protective gear, and maintained group cohesion. The hazard zone became an asset rather than a prison." She paused. "This is inconvenient for the grading rubric." A few cadets shifted uneasily, unsure if that was praise or criticism. Then Var inclined her head, just slightly. "However, the Academy exists to find those who redefine the rubric, not those who merely survive under it." Her eyes swept the group. "Group Delta passes, with distinction." Relief surged through the cadets. Some sagged in place, some laughed softly, some simply gripped a neighbor's arm in silent gratitude. Perhaps acid fog simulations included new modules based on Cadet Group Delta's logs. The official survival manual gained an appendix titled Improvised Environmental Control Structures. Lena's name appeared in the credits, alongside Crix, Ree, Joran, and the rest of the group. On quiet nights, some cadets whispered about the exam on Hazard Zone 12. Most spoke of the human who had built masks from mud and leaves, walls from stone and resin, and a clean air zone in a place meant for suffocation. But those who had stood beside her knew the truth was larger. Under sky that wanted to kill them, in air that burned every unprotected surface, a small group had learned that survival was not a gift handed down from instructors or equipment. It was something constructed, piece by piece, breath by careful breath, out of courage, knowledge, and the refusal to give in. And somewhere beneath the poisonous mist of that hostile world, the stronghold remained, empty, silent, a shell of clay and stone and hardened resin, holding a pocket of gentler air in the middle of a death zone, just as a human cadet had intended.